My son didn't raise his voice when he said it. That's what made it worse. We were standing in my own living room. The same living room I had paid off 23 years ago. The same room where I had carried him across the carpet when he was 6 months old and burning with fever. The same room where his mother used to sit every Sunday afternoon with a cup of tea and tell me we had done a good job raising him. He stood near the fireplace. I stood by the window. And between us was 40 years of my life. "You're too old to run this family anymore, Dad." He said it calmly. Almost gently. Like he was explaining something obvious. Like the sky was blue. Like winter follows fall. Like this was simply the natural order of things. I remember the exact time because I looked at the grandfather clock behind him when he finished speaking. 4:17 p.m. I don't know why the brain chooses certain details to freeze forever, but that one stayed with me. 4:17 p.m. I am 65 years old. My name is Harold Bennett. Most people call me Hal. I live in a 2-story colonial house just outside Greenville, South Carolina. It sits on 3 acres of land that my father bought back in 1978, when this area was still mostly open fields and dirt roads. I was 37 when I took over the family logistics company. 1 warehouse. 3 trucks. 6 employees. I worked 18-hour days for almost a decade before we saw real growth. By the time I turned 50, we were moving regional freight across 4 states. By the time I turned 60, the company employed 42 people, some of them second generation, kids of the men who started with me. I didn't inherit an empire. I built one. Brick by brick. Mile by mile. Contract by contract. And every single Christmas, I handed out bonuses in that warehouse office myself. So when my own son looked at me, not angry, not shouting, just calm, and said I was too old to run this family, it didn't hit like an insult. It hit like a verdict. Now, I want you to sit with something for a moment. There's a difference between being tired and being dismissed. At 65, yes, I move slower in the mornings. Yes, my knees remind me of every truck ramp I climbed in my 40s. But there is a quiet strength that comes with surviving things. With burying a wife. With keeping payroll steady during a recession. With sitting across from a bank manager who thinks you won't make it, and making it anyway. Age is not weakness. It is memory. But in that moment, standing across from my son, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. He didn't see memory. He saw expiration. My son's name is Daniel. He's 38. MBA from Duke. Sharp mind. Confident. Well-spoken. The kind of man who walks into a room and assumes he belongs there. I was proud of that confidence once. Maybe I still am. But confidence, if left unchecked, turns into something else. And that afternoon, I saw the shift. "You've done enough, Dad," he continued, hands resting loosely in his pockets. "You've carried this family for decades. It's time to step back. Let me handle things now. Let me handle things." That's what he said. Not help. Not partner. Handle. His wife, Melissa, was sitting on the couch nearby. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence had a shape to it. A satisfaction. Melissa has always been polished. Organized. Strategic. When Daniel married her 8 years ago, I told myself her ambition would balance his fire. I didn't realize it would redirect it. "You're not as sharp as you used to be," Daniel added, softer now. "The last board meeting, you forgot the updated freight numbers." I didn't forget. I tested him. But I didn't correct him in that moment. Because something had clicked inside me. And when something clicks inside a man my age, it is rarely loud. It is quiet. Like a lock turning. I nodded. Just once. He seemed relieved. That relief told me more than his words ever could. Good, he said. That's all I wanted. We'll transition everything over the next few weeks. I'll talk to the legal team. The legal team. Interesting. I glanced toward the hallway where family portraits lined the wall. My wife, Margaret, smiling in that navy dress she loved. Gone 5 years now. Breast cancer. Fast and merciless. Before she passed, she held my hand in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and said something I have never forgotten. Don't let them rush you out of your own life, Hal. At the time, I thought she meant grief. Turns out she meant something else. Daniel stepped closer, resting a hand briefly on my shoulder. You should enjoy retirement, he said. Spend time gardening. Travel. Relax. Relax. That word again. Said like a reward. Offered like a dismissal. I nodded again. And then I did something he did not expect. I smiled. Not wide. Not dramatic. Just enough. You're right, I said. He blinked. Melissa shifted slightly. I could almost see them recalculating. You're absolutely right, I repeated. Because here's something most people don't understand about men my age. We don't argue when we see the full picture. We observe. We collect. We wait. Daniel exhaled, clearly satisfied. I knew you'd understand. Oh, I understood. More than he realized. Because what Daniel didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that I had already seen the documents. I had already noticed the restructuring proposals. The quiet consultations. The suggested amendments to voting power in the company bylaws. He thought I forgot numbers at the board meeting. I noticed who stayed after it ended. You see, when a son tells his father he is too old to run the family, that sentence doesn't begin that day. It has been building. Quietly. And I had felt the tremor weeks ago. I just hadn't responded. Until now. Daniel grabbed his car keys from the hallway table. We'll come by Sunday, he said. Talk next steps. Sunday. Interesting choice. Sundays had always been my wife's day. Family dinners. Roast chicken. Her rule was simple, no business talk at the table. Daniel knew that. And still he chose Sunday. They left 10 minutes later. The house grew quiet in that heavy way houses do after something has shifted. I stood alone in the living room for a long time. The grandfather clock ticked. 4:42 p.m. 25 minutes had passed. I walked slowly to Margaret's old writing desk near the staircase. Opened the top drawer. Took out the small leather notebook I keep there. Inside it were 3 phone numbers written in ink. Numbers I hoped I'd never need. I stared at them for a moment. Then I picked up my cell phone. And I made one phone call. Not to Daniel. Not to a lawyer. Not yet. To someone who has known me longer than my son has been alive. The phone rang twice. Harold, the voice answered. Calm. Steady. Familiar. It's time, I said. There was a pause. Not confusion. Recognition. Are you sure? I looked around my house. At the photos. At the quiet walls that had heard laughter and grief and arguments and forgiveness. Yes, I said. I'm sure. Another pause. Then. All right. We'll move forward. I ended the call. Placed the phone back on the desk. And for the first time since 4:17 p.m., I felt something solid settle inside my chest. Not anger. Not revenge. Clarity. Because here is the truth about being told you are too old. Sometimes it is not a dismissal. Sometimes it is permission. Permission to stop pretending you don't see what's happening. Permission to act. Sunday was coming. And by Sunday dinner, my son was going to understand something he had never fully grasped. Running a family is not the same thing as inheriting one. I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stood at the sink looking out over the backyard Margaret once loved. The sun was lowering behind the trees. Soft. Golden. Peaceful. If you had driven past the house at that moment, you would have seen a quiet 65-year-old man standing alone in his kitchen. You would have thought nothing had changed. But something had. And the next 72 hours were going to rearrange everything Daniel thought he controlled. I glanced once more at the clock. 4:58 p.m. And for the first time that day, I was not the one being evaluated. Sunday dinners in this house used to mean something. They meant Margaret humming in the kitchen. They meant Daniel setting the table wrong and pretending he hadn't. They meant laughter that carried into the hallway and up the staircase. After she passed, I kept the ritual alive. Not because I enjoy cooking, but because structure is the last thing grief can't steal. By the time Sunday arrived, I had already done 3 things Daniel didn't know about. First, I had a full copy of the amended corporate bylaws printed and highlighted. Second, I had transferred temporary executive authority back to the original charter clause my father drafted in 1983, the one Daniel never bothered to read. And third, I had confirmed something that made everything else make sense. But we're not there yet. Let's go back to Friday. After I made that phone call Thursday afternoon, I drove out to the warehouse early the next morning. I didn't tell Daniel. I didn't tell anyone. I arrived at 6:10 a.m. Old habits don't disappear. They just get quieter. The loading bay lights were still warming up. The air smelled like diesel and cardboard and cold concrete, a smell I've known longer than my son's voice. Frank was already there. Frank Delaney. 68. Started with my father before I took over. Still walks the floor every morning like he owns the place. In some ways, he does. He looked up when I stepped inside. Morning, Hal. Morning. He studied me for half a second longer than usual. You look like you didn't sleep. I slept fine. He didn't push. Frank doesn't push. He waits. I walked into my office. Closed the door. Opened the filing cabinet that Daniel assumes holds outdated records and sentimental junk. What it actually holds, is history. Original incorporation documents. Emergency clauses. Voting thresholds. Authority contingencies triggered by board instability. You'd be surprised how many younger executives skim past the word contingency. They assume stability is permanent. It isn't. 3 weeks ago, I noticed something unusual in the quarterly review packet Daniel emailed to the board. It was subtle. A suggestion to modernize leadership structure. Another suggestion to streamline decision authority. Streamline. A harmless word. Unless you understand what it replaces. He proposed shifting final contract approval from majority board vote to executive discretion, his discretion. He framed it as efficiency. It was consolidation. Now here's the part that bothered me. He hadn't mentioned it to me directly. Not once. That told me this wasn't ambition. It was strategy. And strategy without conversation is intention. I opened the drawer beneath my desk and removed the envelope I had requested from our longtime corporate attorney, Samuel Klein. 72 years old. Sharp as a blade. When I called him Thursday evening, I didn't explain much. I didn't have to. He has known me 35 years. When I said, "It's time," he understood which clause I meant. Clause 14b. Emergency Governance Protection. It was written during the trucking strike of 1987 when a competitor tried to leverage board instability to force a buyout. The clause gives founding ownership the right to temporarily suspend restructuring motions if deemed harmful to long-term family control. Daniel had never read that clause. Because Daniel assumed the company was already his. I sat there Friday morning and reread every word of 14b. Then I signed the activation notice. Not permanent. Temporary. But powerful. At 8:32 a.m., Samuel filed it. By 9:15 a.m., the board received official notice that no governance changes could proceed without my explicit written authorization. At 9:42 a.m., Daniel called me. "Dad," he said carefully, "did you authorize a freeze on structural amendments?" I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the loading docks. "Yes." Silence. "That wasn't necessary." "I disagree." Another silence. Then the shift in tone. "We were trying to protect you from overwork." Protect. That word again. "I've been protecting this company since you were learning to ride a bike," I replied calmly. "Dad, don't do this." "Don't do what?" He didn't answer. Because he couldn't say the real sentence out loud. "Don't stop me." We ended the call without resolution. And that was when I knew Sunday would not be a simple family dinner. Now let me tell you something important. When a son believes he's ready to take over, there are two possibilities. 1, he's earned it. 2, someone has convinced him he has. And that brings me to the third thing I confirmed. Friday afternoon, after leaving the warehouse, I drove to the bank. Not our business bank. The private one downtown. Melissa's father sits on the advisory committee there. I don't dislike the man. But I don't trust coincidence. I requested a review of any recent inquiries regarding collateral leverage tied to Bennett Logistics Holdings. The manager hesitated. That hesitation told me enough. "Mr. Bennett," she said carefully, "there have been exploratory discussions." Exploratory. Another soft word. By whom? She glanced at the screen. Daniel Bennett. And an external consultant. Consultant. I already knew the name before she said it. Thomas Greer. Melissa's uncle. Real estate restructuring specialist. Suddenly the puzzle wasn't subtle anymore. It was architectural. Daniel wasn't just planning leadership transition. He was preparing asset leverage. Our land. Our warehouses. Lines of credit secured against property my father bought with cash. I thanked the manager politely. Walked out without raising my voice. And that was the moment the quiet inside me solidified. Not anger. Not betrayal. Recognition. By the time Sunday arrived, I wasn't reacting. I was positioning. Sunday afternoon came gray and humid. I roasted chicken the way Margaret used to. Set the table properly. 3 plates. Daniel arrived at 5:03 p.m. Melissa followed behind him carrying a bottle of wine she knows I don't drink. Symbolism has always been her strong suit. We exchanged brief greetings. Polite. Measured. Daniel looked confident. Too confident. That's usually a sign someone believes the outcome is already secured. Dinner started quietly. Small talk about traffic. About weather. About a friend's vacation. Then Daniel placed his fork down deliberately. "Dad," he began, "we need to formalize the transition plan." There it was. No hesitation now. I wiped my hands slowly with a napkin. "What transition?" He blinked once. "The one we discussed Thursday." "Ah," I nodded. "That." Melissa shifted slightly in her chair. "We've already spoken with the legal team," Daniel continued. "It's better for everyone if we move quickly. Stability matters." Stability. I let that word sit between us. "You've also spoken with Thomas Greer," I said evenly. His face changed. Just a fraction. Melissa's fork froze mid-air. I've spoken with a few advisors, he replied carefully. And the bank? I asked. Silence. That silence told me more than any confession. You checked on leveraging warehouse assets, I continued. And the land. His jaw tightened. Dad, that's standard due diligence. No, I said softly. It's preparation. Melissa leaned forward. You're misinterpreting everything, she said. We're trying to scale operations. Expand. Modernize. Modernize. Another word that erases history. I built this company to avoid dependency, I said calmly. Not invite it. Daniel's patience thinned. You're thinking small. There it was. That sentence. You're thinking small. I studied my son for a long moment. When did ambition turn into appetite? When your grandfather started this, I said quietly, he swore no bank would ever own even 1 square foot of what we built. That was 40 years ago. Daniel snapped. This isn't the same market. No, I agreed. It isn't. Silence again. Heavy. Measured. Then Daniel leaned back. You're proving my point. Which is? You're too emotionally attached to the past to lead us into the future. There it was again. Too old. Too attached. Too slow. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. Not dramatically. Not rushed. Just deliberate. And I placed a single document on the table. Clause 14B Activation Notice. Daniel stared at it. Melissa leaned closer. What is this? She asked. It's protection, I replied. Daniel scanned the page. His expression shifted from irritation, to confusion, to something else. You can't just freeze governance, he said. I can, I answered calmly. And I did. That's temporary. Yes. He looked up. And what happens when it expires? I held his gaze. That depends. On what? On whether I believe this family is being positioned, or leveraged. The word landed hard. Melissa's composure cracked slightly. You don't trust us, she said. I looked at her evenly. Trust is not assumed. It's demonstrated. Daniel stood up abruptly. You're overreacting. No, I said quietly. I'm responding. He paced once behind his chair. You think I'm trying to steal from you? I think you're moving pieces without telling me. I was going to tell you. When? No answer. The room grew still again. Then Daniel said something that shifted everything. Maybe it's time we consider selling. Selling. The land. The warehouses. The name. He said it like a business option. Not a legacy. I stood slowly. Walked to the window. Looked out at the backyard Margaret once planted with roses. You believe running a family means increasing valuation, I said quietly. He didn't respond. You believe expansion equals strength. Still nothing. Then I turned back toward him. And you believe I'm standing in the way. He didn't deny it. That hurt more than anything else he'd said. But I didn't show it. Because here's something important. When someone believes you're outdated, the worst thing you can do is argue emotionally. The strongest thing you can do is move strategically. I picked up my phone from the counter. And I made another call. On speaker. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Who are you calling? The line rang once. Twice. Then. Good evening, Harold. Samuel Klein's voice filled the room. Evening, Sam, I said calmly. Could you clarify something for my son? A pause. Of course. Regarding succession. Samuel cleared his throat. As of this morning, Harold Bennett remains sole controlling authority under original charter. Any restructuring or sale requires his explicit approval. Additionally, he paused slightly. The trust amendment filed 6 months ago designates contingency ownership not to Daniel Bennett individually, but to the Bennett Family Preservation Trust. Daniel's face went white. Melissa stiffened. What trust? Daniel asked sharply. I met his eyes. The one your mother and I created before she passed. The room went very quiet. Samuel continued calmly. In the event of asset liquidation or leverage against founding property, control automatically transfers to independent trustees. Daniel's voice was barely steady. Who are the trustees? I answered him myself. Frank Delaney. And, he pressed. I held his gaze. And me. Silence. Heavy. Unavoidable. You see, Daniel believed running the family meant inheriting control. He forgot something critical. Control is not transferred by assumption. It is protected by foresight. I ended the call. Placed the phone down gently. And for the first time that evening, my son looked uncertain. Not angry. Not dominant. Uncertain. And uncertainty is the first crack in overconfidence. I walked back to the table. Sat down. And poured myself a glass of water. You're not too old to run this family, Daniel said quietly. I studied him. No, I replied calmly. I'm not. The house fell silent. But this wasn't over. Not even close. Because what Daniel didn't know yet was that the phone call I made Thursday was never about Clause 14b. And what was coming next would change his understanding of leadership entirely. There's a certain kind of silence that only happens after authority shifts. Not loud. Not explosive. Just, recalibrated. That's what filled my dining room after Samuel hung up. Daniel didn't sit back down immediately. He stood there, staring at the table like the wood grain had personally betrayed him. Melissa's posture changed first. She straightened, folded her hands, and did what strategic people do when they realize the terrain isn't what they thought it was. She adjusted. What trust? Daniel asked again, slower this time. His voice wasn't angry anymore. It was searching. The Bennett Family Preservation Trust, I repeated. Your mother insisted on it. He looked at me sharply. Mom never told me about any trust. She wasn't required to. That landed harder than I intended. I softened my tone. She wanted to protect the land. The company. And you. Protect me from what? He snapped. From yourself, Melissa said quietly before I could answer. The room froze. Daniel turned toward her. What does that mean? Melissa hesitated. I watched her carefully. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. She corrected quickly. I mean from risk. From overextension. But it was too late. The sentence had already done its work. From yourself. Daniel looked back at me. You think I'm reckless? I think you're ambitious, I said evenly. And ambition without memory becomes appetite. He exhaled sharply. You're twisting everything. No, I replied. I'm clarifying. Now let me tell you something important. When someone begins to lose narrative control, they try to regain it through emotion. Daniel did exactly that. You blindsided me, he said. You filed legal freezes. You created trusts. You talked to attorneys. All without telling me. And you talked to banks and consultants without telling me, I answered calmly. That was preparation. So was this. Silence again. Then Daniel said something that told me he still didn't understand the full picture. "You don't trust me to lead." That wasn't the question. It never had been. I leaned forward slightly. "I don't trust anyone who believes leadership is entitlement." His jaw tightened. "You raised me to take over this company." "No," I said softly. "I raised you to earn it." Melissa stood slowly. "This is becoming personal." "It has always been personal," I replied. "Because here is the truth no one likes to admit. Family businesses aren't just numbers. They are bloodlines. They are history. They are graves in local cemeteries with the same last name carved into stone. And when someone talks about selling them like inventory, it becomes personal." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "So what now?" he asked. There it was. The real question. Not anger. Not pride. Direction. And this is where things shifted again. Because what Daniel didn't know was that the trust amendment Samuel mentioned was only half of it. Margaret had been sicker than we let anyone see during her final year. Daniel thought she was tired. He thought the treatments were working longer than they were. We didn't correct him. Not because we wanted to lie, but because some burdens are unnecessary. 3 months before she passed, Margaret asked me to bring her a yellow folder from our safe. Inside it were documents she had been quietly reviewing for weeks. Insurance revisions. Asset protection clauses. Succession frameworks. Your mother was sharper than any board member I've ever met. And she saw something long before I did. One evening, sitting in her hospital room with the blinds half closed against the afternoon sun, she said something that unsettled me. "Daniel is brilliant," she said softly. "But he's impatient with limits." "He's young," I replied. She shook her head faintly. "It's not youth. It's momentum." I didn't understand at the time. I do now. She reached for my hand. "Promise me something. Anything. If he ever confuses inheritance with authority, slow him down. Not stop him. Slow him down. There's wisdom in that distinction." I promised her. And I have kept that promise. Now, back in the dining room, Daniel was waiting for an answer. "So what now?" he repeated. I stood up slowly and walked toward the hallway. "Come with me," I said. He hesitated. Then followed. Melissa stayed at the table. I didn't invite her. Some conversations belong to blood first. We walked down the hall to Margaret's old study. I haven't changed it since she passed. Her books remain stacked exactly as she left them. Her reading glasses still sit on the corner of the desk. Daniel stepped inside quietly. He hadn't been in here alone in years. I opened the bottom drawer of her desk. Removed a sealed envelope. His name written on it in Margaret's handwriting. Daniel Bennett. He stared at it. "What is that?" "Something your mother prepared." He didn't move. I handed it to him. For when the time came. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside was a letter. And a flash drive. He unfolded the letter first. His eyes scanned the first few lines. His posture changed almost immediately. Then his breathing did. Margaret always wrote with clarity. No excess words. No emotional manipulation. Just truth. I won't repeat the entire letter here. But there were 3 sentences that mattered. If you are reading this, it means you believe you are ready to lead. Leadership is not proven by expansion. It is proven by restraint. And if you are pushing your father aside to move faster, you are not leading. You are overtaking. Daniel's hand tightened around the paper. He swallowed once. "This isn't fair," he said quietly. Fair. That word again. Margaret had anticipated that too. The flash drive contained a video she recorded 6 weeks before she passed. I connected it to the small monitor in her study. Pressed play. The screen flickered. And there she was. Thinner than Daniel remembered. But steady. Composed. Her eyes, the same eyes that used to stop Daniel mid-excuse when he was 13, looked directly into the camera. "Danny," she began gently. His face crumpled slightly at the nickname. "You will one day believe you are smarter than your father." He let out a soft, involuntary breath. "I know this because you are smart. And because ambition feels like clarity when you're inside it." She paused. "But leadership is not about being the strongest voice in the room. It is about being the last one standing when things collapse." Daniel's eyes filled. "You will want to modernize. Expand. Leverage. That is not wrong." Another pause. "But if you ever think the land is just an asset, you have forgotten who you are." The video ended with her smiling faintly. "Slow down, my son." The screen went dark. Daniel stood there for a long time without speaking. When he finally did, his voice was barely steady. "You showed Sam this?" "Yes." "And Frank?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. "She thought I would try to push you out. She thought you might rush." Silence again. But this silence was different. It wasn't defensive. It was reflective. "You think I'm trying to sell the company out from under you," he said quietly. "I think you are willing to risk control to accelerate growth. That's business. That's exposure." He looked at me again. And for the first time since Thursday, I saw something that hadn't been there before. Not dominance. Not strategy. Doubt. And doubt is not weakness. It is recalibration. But we weren't finished. Because Daniel still didn't know about the first phone call. The one I made Thursday afternoon. The one that had nothing to do with legal clauses. The one that would determine whether he ever sat in my office as president. I walked past him and turned off the monitor. "Your mother believed you could lead," I said quietly. "Then why all this?" "Because she also believed you needed to earn the weight." He nodded faintly. Then something unexpected happened. He sat down in her old reading chair. Not as a CEO. Not as a challenger. As a son. "I didn't want to sell," he said quietly. "Not really." "Then why talk about it?" "Because Melissa's family keeps telling us we're underutilizing potential." There it was. External pressure. Narrative contamination. They say we're sitting on gold. "And what do you think?" I asked. He stared at the dark screen. "I think I don't want to be small." There it was. The real fear. Not money. Not control. Smallness. I stepped closer. "Leadership isn't about being big," I said softly. "It's about being steady." He didn't answer. Because something inside him was shifting. But here is the part you need to understand. Reflection is not transformation. Not yet. Because while Daniel was absorbing his mother's words, Melissa was still in the dining room. And she had made a phone call of her own. One I didn't hear. One I didn't expect. And by the time Daniel walked back into the hallway, everything was about to escalate in a way none of us saw coming. When Daniel and I walked back into the dining room, Melissa was no longer sitting where we left her. She was standing by the kitchen counter. Phone in hand. Screen dark. But her expression told me something had shifted. You learn to read rooms after 65 years. The air had changed. Not loud. Not explosive. Just sharpened. Daniel looked at her. "We need to talk," he said quietly. She studied his face carefully. "Did he show you something?" she asked. Yes. Her eyes flicked toward me. What exactly did he show you? Daniel didn't answer immediately. He walked past her and picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. Mom left instructions, he said. Melissa's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. What kind of instructions? The kind that slow things down. There was something in his tone that hadn't been there before. Less certainty. More weight. Melissa glanced between us. Then she did something subtle. She straightened her shoulders. And smiled. Strategic people don't retreat. They reposition. That's fine, she said smoothly. Slowing down is still forward movement. Daniel frowned slightly. That's not what she meant. And what did she mean? Melissa asked gently. That I was rushing. She laughed lightly. Ambition isn't rushing, Daniel. It's vision. I didn't interrupt. Because sometimes the truth exposes itself when left uninterrupted. She walked toward him slowly. You want to build something bigger, she said. That's not greed. That's growth. Daniel hesitated. And I saw it again. The tug of war. Between inheritance and influence. Between blood and marriage. Between memory and momentum. Dad froze governance, Daniel said. Melissa blinked. What? He activated Clause 14b. Her composure flickered for a fraction of a second. Then returned. That's temporary, she said quickly. Yes. So we waited out. There it was. Waited out. She wasn't recalibrating. She was calculating. Daniel looked at her. And the trust? What trust? The one Mom set up. She went still. What trust, Daniel? He didn't answer. He looked at me instead. That look was different now. Not confrontational. Clarifying. I met his eyes calmly. Melissa, I said evenly, have you ever read the original charter documents? She smiled faintly. I leave legacy nostalgia to you. Interesting phrasing. Daniel ran a hand over his face. Melissa, he said quietly, did you call Thomas? Her eyes didn't move. Yes. Why? To inform him there may be delays. Inform him. Not discuss. Not consult. Inform. How much did you tell him? Daniel pressed. Enough, she replied. Silence again. But this silence carried friction. Daniel stepped back slightly. You told him about the freeze? Yes. And the trust? A pause. Yes. That landed. Hard. I watched Daniel's shoulders drop almost imperceptibly. You weren't supposed to, he said. She blinked. Why not? Because this is internal. We are married, she replied sharply. There is no internal and external. There it was. The collision point. Family by blood. Family by law. Different definitions. I stepped forward slowly. There is always internal and external, I said quietly. Especially in business. Melissa's eyes sharpened. Business, she echoed. I thought this was family. It is, I replied. Which is why business doesn't get to override it. She crossed her arms. You're turning him against me. No, I said calmly. I'm letting him see clearly. Daniel looked at her. Why did you call Thomas so quickly? Because momentum matters. He stared at her. Momentum for what? She hesitated. Just a second too long. And in that hesitation, everything shifted. You told him to move forward anyway, Daniel said quietly. She didn't answer. Melissa, he pressed. Finally, she exhaled. I told him to prepare alternate leverage paths. The words hung in the air. Alternate leverage paths. Even after governance freeze. Even after trust activation. She had kept the machine moving. Daniel took a step back. You said we'd slow down. We are, she insisted. But that doesn't mean we stop preparing. Preparing for what? For when this expires. There it was. Not leadership. Not patience. Expiration. She was waiting for me to age out. Daniel looked at her like he was seeing something for the first time. You think this is just a delay, he said slowly. It is, she replied firmly. You're the future of this company. And if I'm not ready? You are. How do you know? Because you refuse to stay small. Silence again. But this time, the silence belonged to Daniel. Not me. He walked slowly to the window. Stared out at the yard. I didn't speak. Melissa watched him carefully. And then her phone vibrated. Once. Twice. She glanced at it. Her expression changed. Not dramatically. But enough. Daniel turned. Who is that? Thomas. What does he want? She hesitated. Nothing urgent. Answer it. She didn't want to. I could see it. But she did. Hello. A pause. Then her face went pale. Slow down, she said sharply. What do you mean filed? Daniel stiffened. What? She listened for several seconds. Then. That's impossible. Another pause. Daniel stepped closer. Melissa. She ended the call slowly. Looked at both of us. And for the first time that evening. She didn't have a strategic expression. She had fear. What? Daniel demanded. Thomas says the independent trustees initiated a review. Daniel turned toward me slowly. What review? The one that triggers when external consultation attempts to leverage trust-protected assets, I replied calmly. His eyes widened. You filed that too? No, I said. Your mother did. Silence. Melissa shook her head. This is ridiculous. It's procedural intimidation. It's procedural protection, I corrected gently. What does that mean? Daniel asked. It means, I said evenly, any attempt to restructure holdings while under trust oversight automatically triggers a compliance audit. Melissa's composure cracked. You can't audit us. I didn't, I replied. Daniel stared at me. You knew this would happen. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? Because I needed to see whether you'd slow down. Silence. Thick. Unavoidable. Daniel turned slowly toward Melissa. Did you authorize anything after Thursday? She didn't answer immediately. That hesitation was louder than any confession. Melissa, he said. Yes, she whispered. For what? For contingency asset packaging. Daniel stepped back. You moved forward. It was protective, she insisted. If your father blocks transition, we need options. Options. That word again. Daniel's breathing changed. You said we were a team. We are. Then why didn't you tell me you were filing alternate packages? Because you hesitate when he looks at you. That sentence cut deeper than she intended. Daniel froze. What does that mean? It means you still see him as authority. Silence. You are authority, she said firmly. You need to act like it. Daniel looked at me. Then back at her. And I saw something fracture. Not love. But narrative. The narrative that this was a simple generational handoff. It wasn't. It was influence. It was pressure. It was external ambition wearing internal language. Did you ever actually want to keep the company independent? Daniel asked quietly. Melissa hesitated. Of course. That's not what I asked. Another pause. Then. I want it to be significant. And it isn't, he asked. She didn't answer. That was enough. Daniel turned to me slowly. You weren't protecting the company from me, he said. I was protecting you from acceleration. Melissa stepped forward. This is manipulation. No, I said calmly. This is exposure. Daniel rubbed his face. Thomas says the audit will freeze any outside financing. Yes. For how long? As long as necessary. Melissa shook her head. You're sabotaging growth. I'm preserving control. She laughed bitterly. Control for what? You won't be here forever. That sentence landed differently. Not as strategy. As impatience. Daniel looked at her sharply. Stop. She exhaled. You know I didn't mean it like that. But she had. We all heard it. And here's the truth. Ambition often hides beneath partnership until the timeline shortens. Daniel walked slowly back toward the table. He sat down heavily. Not defeated. Thinking. Melissa remained standing. I can't believe this, she said quietly. We were this close. Close to what? Daniel asked. To transforming everything. At what cost? She didn't answer. Because cost is never just financial. It's relational. It's structural. It's identity. I walked back to my chair and sat down. Daniel, I said quietly, leadership isn't about speed. He didn't look at me. It's about weight. Melissa's phone vibrated again. She ignored it. Daniel finally spoke. You moved forward without me. She stepped closer. I was protecting our future. By bypassing me. You hesitate. I reflect. You stall. I assess. Silence again. And this time. The silence belonged to Melissa. Because Daniel wasn't defending ambition anymore. He was questioning it. But this still wasn't the turning point. Not yet. Because what none of them knew was that Thomas Greer had just made a mistake. A procedural one. And by morning, that mistake would pull something into the light that even I hadn't anticipated. And when it surfaced, this would no longer be about control. It would be about loyalty. Daniel looked at me slowly. What happens now? I held his gaze. That depends on what you do next. The room was quiet. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked faintly. 7:42 p.m. And for the first time since Thursday, I wasn't the one being replaced. I was the one being tested. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was anxious. Because I was waiting. There's a difference. Anxiety is fear of what might happen. Waiting is certainty that something will. At 6:18 a.m., my phone rang. Not Daniel. Not Melissa. Samuel. I answered before the second ring finished. Morning, I said. There was a brief pause on the other end. Harold, Samuel began carefully, Thomas Greer filed something he shouldn't have. I didn't interrupt. When the compliance audit triggered, he attempted to move a parallel filing through a subsidiary entity. I closed my eyes slowly. There it was. Momentum overriding caution. He used a holding company. Melissa's family controls, Samuel continued. But he referenced trust-protected property as prospective collateral. Prospective collateral. My land. My warehouses. My father's name on deeds that have never seen a bank's claim. That crosses the line, Samuel said quietly. Yes, I replied. He assumed the freeze only applied to direct governance restructuring. He didn't account for preservation clause extensions. Meaning he believed this was procedural theater. It wasn't. What does that trigger? I asked calmly. A forensic review. I let that settle. For how long? Indefinite until cleared. And who reviews? An independent fiduciary panel. Which meant something very specific. Not my lawyers. Not his. Neutral eyes. Neutral hands. And Daniel? Samuel asked. He doesn't know yet. You should tell him before the panel does. I will. There was another pause. Harold, Samuel said quietly, this could get messy. It already is. I ended the call. Set the phone down. And stared at the kitchen table. Margaret used to sit there at sunrise with her coffee. She would say, if something's rotting, don't cover it. Air it. I think she knew. Not the details. But the pattern. By 8:05 a.m., Daniel was standing in my driveway. Alone. He looked like he hadn't slept either. When I opened the door, he didn't waste time. What did Thomas do? I stepped aside. Come in. He walked into the kitchen. The house felt different in daylight. Less tense. More honest. He attempted to move a collateral outline through a secondary holding entity, I said calmly. Daniel went still. You're sure? Yes. He wouldn't do that without approval. He believed the freeze was narrow. Daniel's jaw tightened. Did Melissa know? I don't know. That was the truth. He ran a hand through his hair. This is bad. Yes. How bad? Bad enough that an independent panel will review everything. Silence. Daniel leaned against the counter. He promised me he wouldn't move anything without direct sign-off. Did you give it? No. I studied him carefully. And here's something important. When someone says, I didn't authorize that, there are two possibilities. 1, they're lying. 2, they've lost control of someone they trusted. I didn't see deception in his eyes. I saw something else. Displacement. Daniel pulled out his phone. I need to talk to her. You should. He stepped outside to call Melissa. I didn't follow. Some conversations must unfold without an audience. I watched through the window as he paced near the oak tree in the yard. His posture was tight. His movements sharper than usual. At one point, he stopped completely. Stared at the ground. Then at the sky. Then he ended the call. He came back inside slowly. She says she didn't authorize collateral referencing trust property. Did she know Thomas was preparing it? Yes. Did she tell him to stop after Thursday? A pause. No. There it was. Permission by omission. Daniel sat down at the table heavily. He says he was protecting future leverage options. Of course he does, I replied evenly. Silence again. But this silence felt different from Sunday night. Less combative. More reflective. I didn't want this to spiral, Daniel said quietly. Spirals don't start loud, I answered. They start small. He stared at his hands. I thought I was building. You were accelerating. He exhaled slowly. Melissa believes we're underachieving. And what do you believe? He didn't answer immediately. That delay told me more than any argument. Dad, he said finally, what if she's right? About what? That we're thinking too conservatively. I leaned back slightly. Expansion is not wrong. He looked up. Then why fight it? I'm not fighting expansion, I said calmly. I'm fighting dependency. Silence. You leveraged nothing when you built this, he said. That's why we still own it. He nodded faintly. But markets change. Yes. And risk tolerance changes too. Only if memory fades. He leaned back in his chair. I didn't mean what I said Thursday. Which part? That you're too old. I studied him. You meant you're ready. Yes. Those are not the same sentence. Silence. Then something shifted again. His phone buzzed. He looked down. His face changed. What? I asked. It's from the fiduciary panel. Already. He opened the message. Read quickly. Then read again slower. What does it say? They've frozen any exploratory leverage filings pending review. I nodded. And they're requesting direct statements from primary stakeholders. Meaning you. Yes. And Melissa? Yes. And Thomas. Daniel looked up slowly. This is going to get ugly. Only if there's something to hide. He didn't respond. Because that question wasn't directed at him alone. At 11:30 a.m., Melissa arrived. She didn't knock hard. She didn't storm in. But she wasn't composed the way she had been Sunday. She walked into the kitchen and looked directly at Daniel. You didn't tell me he filed collateral language, she said immediately. I didn't know, Daniel replied. She looked at me. This is intimidation. No, I answered evenly. It's compliance. She stepped forward. Thomas said it was theoretical. Theoretical filings don't trigger forensic review. Silence. Daniel looked at her carefully. Did you know he included the warehouse annex in preliminary language? She froze. Just slightly. I knew he was evaluating options. That's not what I asked. Another pause. Then. Yes. There it was. Daniel's shoulders dropped. Why didn't you tell me? Because you hesitate, she replied again. That word. Hesitate. I assess, he said quietly. You stall. He shook his head slowly. No. I weigh. She crossed her arms. We are losing momentum. He stared at her. At what cost? She didn't answer. Because cost wasn't part of her vocabulary the same way it was in mine. For her, risk was abstract. For me, risk was memory. Daniel stood up slowly. Did you want to tell me about the subsidiary filing? Yes. When? After the freeze expired. He laughed once. Soft. Not amused. You were going to tell me after it was too late to stop. She opened her mouth. Closed it. That silence was confirmation. Daniel turned to me. You weren't protecting the company from me. I was protecting you from momentum that wasn't yours. He nodded slowly. Melissa stepped closer. You're letting him control you. No, Daniel said quietly. He's slowing me. And that's different. Yes. Silence. Then Melissa said something that changed the tone entirely. If we don't expand, someone else will. That's not our problem, I replied calmly. It becomes our problem when they outgrow us. Daniel looked at her. Is that what this is about? What? Status. Her eyes sharpened. This isn't about status. Then what is it? It's about scale. And why does scale matter so much? She hesitated. Because beneath scale, there is always comparison. And beneath comparison, there is insecurity. I don't want us to be small, she said quietly. Daniel stared at her. We're not small. She didn't respond. And that silence told him everything. For her. We were. Daniel stepped back slowly. You don't see this as legacy. I see it as potential. And you think legacy is limitation. She didn't answer. Because that wasn't entirely wrong. The grandfather clock ticked faintly from the hallway. 12:14 p.m. The panel would begin review by afternoon. And here's what none of us knew yet. The subsidiary filing Thomas initiated had attached a preliminary valuation memo. One that estimated liquidation figures. And that memo contained something neither Daniel nor Melissa had seen. Because Thomas had included a note. A private note. About acquisition interest from a third party. An out-of-state logistics conglomerate. And when that note surfaced, this would no longer be about leverage. It would be about intent. And intent changes everything. Daniel looked at me slowly. What happens if the panel finds intentional bypass? They'll recommend removal from executive candidacy. He froze. For me. For anyone involved. Silence. Heavy. Melissa's breath hitched slightly. You'd let them remove him? I don't decide, I replied calmly. The charter does. Daniel looked between us. Then down at the table. And in that moment. He wasn't a future CEO. He was a man realizing influence can move faster than judgment. Dad, he said quietly, if they uncover more. I met his eyes. Then we deal with truth. Because here's something most people misunderstand. Power isn't in preventing exposure. It's in surviving it. The phone buzzed again. Panel notification. Document retrieval initiated. Daniel exhaled slowly. Melissa went still. And I knew. The next 48 hours would not test my authority. They would test their loyalty. The notification came at 2:37 p.m. I remember the time because Daniel was standing at the sink, staring out at the yard the way he used to when he was a boy trying to decide whether to confess something. Melissa was sitting at the table, arms folded, phone face down in front of her. When Daniel's screen lit up again, he didn't hesitate this time. He opened it immediately. His face changed. Not shock. Recognition. What? I asked quietly. He swallowed once. They pulled the valuation memo. Melissa stiffened. What memo? Daniel didn't answer her. He kept reading. Then he looked up at me slowly. There's a third-party acquisition note attached. Silence. The air felt heavier. Acquisition. I repeated calmly. Yes. Melissa reached for her phone. Thomas said it was exploratory. Exploratory doesn't include draft sale projections, Daniel said quietly. Her fingers stopped mid-reach. What projections? She asked. Daniel turned the screen toward her. I didn't need to see it. I could already feel where this was going. Projected liquidation value based on expedited asset conversion. Projected employee reduction margins. Projected timeline for absorption into national conglomerate infrastructure. Daniel's jaw tightened. They weren't just evaluating leverage, he said. Melissa read faster. Her face drained of color. That's not finalized, she said quickly. It's drafted, Daniel replied. That doesn't mean. It means someone prepared to sell. Silence. Heavy. Unavoidable. Daniel looked at her. Did you know about this? No. Did Thomas mention acquisition interest? He said there were industry conversations. That's not what I asked. She hesitated. That hesitation was louder than anything she could have said. He said there was interest, she admitted quietly. Daniel stepped back slowly. Interest in what? In partnership. That says acquisition. He said acquisition language is standard. For valuation. For leverage positioning. Daniel stared at her. Did you want to sell? No. Did you want the option? She didn't answer. Because option is often the first step toward intent. I finally spoke. Who is the conglomerate? Daniel scrolled. Interstate Logistics Group. I knew the name. Everyone in regional freight knew the name. They absorb. They consolidate. They don't preserve. They erase. They've been buying mid-sized family operations for 5 years, I said quietly. Melissa looked at me sharply. It was hypothetical. No, I replied calmly. It was preparatory. Daniel's breathing changed. You told me this was about expansion. It is, she insisted. Expansion into what? He pressed. Absorption. She stood abruptly. You're twisting everything. No, Daniel said quietly. I'm finally reading it. Silence. I walked slowly to the table and placed my hands on the back of the chair. Daniel, I said gently, what does the memo say about employee retention? He scrolled again. His face hardened. Projected workforce reduction, 60%. Melissa's breath caught. That's not guaranteed. It's calculated, I corrected softly. Efficiency scaling, she said quickly. Layoffs, Daniel said. Silence. Then something shifted. Daniel looked at me. Not as opponent. Not as obstacle. As reference. You knew this could happen, he said quietly. I suspected, I replied. You knew Thomas would escalate. I knew momentum rarely stops itself. Melissa shook her head. You're making him doubt me. No, Daniel said calmly. The memo is. The grandfather clock ticked from the hallway. 3:02 p.m. Panel review confirmation pinged again. Document flagged for intent review. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. This isn't just leverage, he said quietly. This is positioning. Yes, I replied. Melissa's composure cracked. You're acting like I plotted this. Did you? Daniel asked quietly. She stared at him. No. Did you encourage scale without asking how far it would go? Silence. That silence was admission. I wanted us to grow, she whispered. At what cost? He asked. She didn't answer. Because cost was no longer abstract. It was names. Faces. Men who have worked those docks for decades. Frank. Luis. Darren. People who don't exist on spreadsheets. I stepped closer. Daniel, I said quietly, leadership isn't about what you can build. He looked at me. It's about what you're willing to lose. Silence. Melissa's phone vibrated again. She ignored it. Daniel looked at her. Did you ever actually see this as ours? Yes. As ours to preserve? Yes. Or ours to convert? She hesitated. And that hesitation answered him. He stepped back slowly. You saw potential, he said. Yes. I saw legacy. Silence. 2 definitions. 1 conflict. Daniel's phone pinged again. Panel inquiry request, formal statement required within 24 hours. He looked at me. If they determine acquisition intent, they will recommend disqualification from executive succession, I finished. For both of us. For anyone materially involved. Melissa went pale. You can't let that happen. I don't control it, I replied calmly. But you influence it, she said sharply. No, I answered evenly. The documents influence it. Silence. Daniel leaned against the counter. What happens if I step aside voluntarily? Melissa turned sharply. You can't. I'm asking him. I met his eyes. If you step aside, the review continues. And if they clear me? You'll still need to rebuild trust. Silence. Melissa stepped forward. You're going to let a panel decide our future? It's not our future, Daniel said quietly. It's the company's. That sentence landed like a shift. Because for the first time, he separated the two. Melissa looked at him like she didn't recognize him. This is fear, she said. No, he replied. This is wait. Silence again. The afternoon light shifted slightly across the kitchen floor. 3:26 p.m. I remembered something Margaret once said. Ambition feels righteous until it touches something sacred. Daniel looked at me slowly. What would you have done? About what? If you were my age. I didn't answer immediately. Because honesty matters more than performance. I would have pushed, I said. He nodded faintly. But I would have listened sooner. Silence. Melissa looked between us. You're choosing him. Daniel shook his head slowly. No. Then what are you doing? I'm choosing clarity. Silence. The phone buzzed again. Panel notification, third-party interest confirmation received. Daniel read it. His shoulders dropped slightly. They've confirmed interstate-initiated preliminary contact before Thomas's memo. Melissa's face went blank. That's not possible. It's time-stamped. She swallowed. He didn't tell me. Daniel looked at her carefully. Would it have changed anything? She didn't answer. Because sometimes truth is not in what we do. It's in what we're willing to allow. Daniel exhaled slowly. They weren't waiting for us to expand. No, I said quietly. They were waiting for us to loosen. Silence. Heavy. Daniel looked at me. You froze governance just in time. Yes. And activated the trust. Yes. And called Sam. Yes. He nodded slowly. You saw this coming. I saw momentum. Melissa finally spoke again. I never meant to sell. Intent isn't always declared, I replied calmly. Sometimes it's tolerated. She stared at me. You're destroying everything. No, Daniel said quietly. He's protecting it. Silence. The room felt different now. Less combative. More exposed. Daniel looked at me. What do you want me to do? That question mattered. Because it wasn't about authority anymore. It was about responsibility. I want you to decide, I said. Between what? Speed and stewardship. Silence. Melissa stepped closer. You can have both. Not if one overrides the other, I replied softly. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Then opened them. And for the first time since Thursday. He looked steady. I'll submit my statement to the panel, he said quietly. Melissa's breath caught. And I'll disclose everything. Her eyes widened. Everything? Yes. That could implicate Thomas. It already does. Silence. She stared at him. You're willing to burn bridges. I'm willing to stop pretending they're stable. That sentence changed the temperature of the room. Because now this wasn't about me. It wasn't about governance. It wasn't about age. It was about loyalty. Daniel turned to me. If they disqualify me. They won't, I said calmly. How do you know? Because they review intent. And yours wasn't to erase. Silence. Melissa looked at him slowly. You're choosing his side. Daniel shook his head gently. I'm choosing the company's. She looked like she wanted to argue again. But something stopped her. Maybe the memo. Maybe the timestamps. Maybe the realization that momentum without consent becomes takeover. The clock ticked again. 3:48 p.m. The review would take hours. Maybe days. And here's what none of them knew yet. The fiduciary panel had already scheduled a preliminary recommendation. And that recommendation would not only address Daniel. It would address Melissa's involvement. And when that letter arrived, this would no longer be about ambition. It would be about consequence. Daniel looked at me one more time. Dad. Yes. I shouldn't have said what I said Thursday. I held his gaze. No, I replied calmly. You shouldn't have. Silence. But I'm glad you did. He frowned slightly. Why? Because now we're not pretending. And sometimes truth requires insult to surface. The phone buzzed again. Preliminary panel decision scheduled for tomorrow at 9 a.m. 48 hours. That's all it took to test a family built over 40 years. Daniel stared at the message. Melissa went very still. And I realized something important. This was never about being too old. It was about being too steady to rush. And tomorrow morning, we would find out whether steadiness still mattered. The email came at 8:57 a.m. 3 minutes early. People who run independent review panels do that sometimes. They don't like drama. They don't like countdowns. They prefer precision. Daniel was sitting across from me at the kitchen table. Melissa stood near the doorway. No one had touched their coffee. The subject line was simple. Preliminary recommendation, Bennett Logistics Review. Daniel didn't open it immediately. He looked at me first. Not for permission. For steadiness. I nodded once. He opened it. He read the first paragraph silently. Then the second. His breathing slowed instead of quickened. That told me something before he spoke. What does it say? Melissa asked, her voice tight. Daniel kept reading. Then he exhaled slowly. They've separated intent from action. Silence. And? I prompted gently. They determined I did not authorize acquisition positioning. Melissa stepped forward quickly. So you're cleared. He continued reading. However, he said quietly. There it was. However is where truth lives. They've cited negligence in oversight. He swallowed once. They're recommending a 6-month probationary period under founding supervision. Silence. Heavy. But not devastating. Probation. Not removal. Melissa grabbed the back of a chair. And me? She asked sharply. Daniel's eyes moved down the page. He went still. Then he looked up at her. They recommend suspension of advisory access pending further review. Her face went pale. What? Until intent clarification is complete. That's absurd. They cite documented communication with Thomas regarding leverage momentum post-freeze. She stared at him. You're not going to let them do that. I don't control it, he said quietly. You influence it. He looked at me. I didn't speak. Because this wasn't my decision to lead anymore. It was his. Melissa's voice hardened. This is his doing. Daniel's expression changed. No, he said evenly. It's the memo's doing. You could challenge it. I won't. Silence. You're choosing this, she demanded. I'm accepting it. Her eyes filled with something I hadn't seen before. Not calculation. Not frustration. Fear. This is humiliating. Daniel looked at her carefully. No, he said quietly. It's corrective. Silence. The grandfather clock ticked in the hallway. 9:04 a.m. 47 hours ago, Daniel told me I was too old to run this family. Now he was under probation. But here's what mattered. His posture wasn't defensive. It was grounded. What does probation mean? Melissa asked sharply. It means, Daniel said slowly, for 6 months I operate under joint review with Dad and the trustees. And after? If performance aligns with preservation charter, full succession proceeds. Silence. And if it doesn't, she pressed. He didn't answer. Because he didn't need to. Melissa looked at me. You engineered this. No, I replied calmly. I preserved it. She shook her head. You froze governance. Yes. You activated trust clauses. Yes. You called attorneys. Yes. And now he's under supervision. Yes. That's control. No, Daniel said quietly. That's structure. Silence. She looked at him like she didn't recognize him. This isn't the plan. No, he agreed. It's not. The room felt different now. Not tense. Recalibrated. Daniel folded the email slowly. They've requested Thomas's statement by end of day. Melissa went still. He won't cooperate. They'll subpoena if necessary. She stared at Daniel. You're going to let him hang? He made filings without full disclosure. He was protecting us. He was positioning us, Daniel corrected. Silence. Melissa's phone buzzed. She looked at it. Thomas. She didn't answer. For the first time since I've known her. She looked uncertain. Daniel stood up slowly. I'm going to the warehouse. Now? She asked. Yes. For what? To stand in front of the people whose jobs were listed under reduction margins. That sentence landed hard. She opened her mouth. Closed it. He looked at me. Come with me. I nodded. We drove in silence. The road to the warehouse felt longer than usual. Daniel didn't speak until we pulled into the lot. I didn't see it, he said quietly. See what? How fast it was moving. That's what momentum does. He nodded faintly. I thought I was steering. You were accelerating. He parked. Sat there a moment. You're not too old, he said quietly. I almost smiled. No, I replied calmly. I'm not. We stepped out. The warehouse was already active. Forklifts humming. Voices echoing. Frank spotted us immediately. He walked over slowly. Everything all right? He asked. Daniel looked at him. No, he said honestly. Frank nodded once. Honesty travels differently than authority. Daniel stepped onto the loading floor. Called for attention. The engines quieted gradually. Men turned. Women turned. People who have known him since he was a teenager turned. I need to say something, Daniel began. His voice didn't shake. I made decisions recently without full clarity. Silence. I believed I was building something bigger. He paused. I didn't account for what it could cost. No one spoke. Because people who work with their hands understand cost differently. I won't let that happen again, he said quietly. Silence. Then Frank stepped forward slightly. You selling us? He asked bluntly. Daniel didn't hesitate. No. Frank nodded once. Then fix it. That was it. No applause. No drama. Just expectation. Daniel looked at me briefly. Then back at them. I will. The engines restarted slowly. Work resumed. But something had shifted. Trust doesn't evaporate overnight. It recalibrates. Back in the office, Daniel closed the door. He sat down slowly. I need to call Thomas. Yes, I replied. He stared at his phone. You won't intervene? No. Silence. He dialed. Put it on speaker. Thomas answered quickly. Daniel. What did you attach to the memo? Daniel asked evenly. A pause. Standard valuation projections. You attached acquisition language. Silence. It was exploratory. You included workforce reduction percentages. That's standard modeling. You included conglomerate acquisition timelines. Another pause. You asked for expansion. I did not ask for liquidation. Silence. Thomas's tone hardened slightly. You need leverage to scale. Not like that. You're being naive. No, Daniel replied calmly. I was. Silence. They've frozen review, Daniel continued. You'll receive a formal request. Thomas exhaled sharply. This is overreaction. No, Daniel said evenly. It's correction. You're going to let your father dictate your career. Daniel looked at me briefly. Then back at the phone. He's not dictating, he said quietly. He's anchoring. Silence. Daniel, Thomas said carefully, momentum wins markets. Not if it costs identity, Daniel replied. Another pause. You're walking away from growth. I'm walking toward stewardship. Silence. Then Thomas said something that ended the conversation. You're thinking small. Daniel didn't flinch this time. No, he replied calmly. I'm thinking long. He ended the call. The room felt lighter. Not resolved. But aligned. He looked at me. I almost believed him. I know. Silence. What happens next? He asked. You work. Under supervision. Yes. For 6 months. Yes. And after? That depends on consistency. He nodded slowly. Melissa hadn't called again. That silence worried me more than argument. Because sometimes silence is recalculation. And recalculation doesn't stop at one failed attempt. Daniel leaned back in the chair. I don't want to lose her. I studied him carefully. You don't have to. But she has to decide what she values. Silence. If she still wants scale, he asked. Then you decide what you can live with. He nodded faintly. The grandfather clock ticked faintly through the office wall. 11:12 a.m. Probation had begun. Not punishment. Structure. Daniel stood up slowly. I'll send my formal statement now. Yes. And Dad? Yes. Thank you. I didn't respond immediately. Because gratitude isn't the point. Continuity is. I promised your mother I'd slow you if needed, I said quietly. He looked at me. And now? Now you slow yourself. Silence. He nodded. Outside, trucks rolled out of the loading bay. Business continued. That's the thing about legacy. It doesn't shout. It persists. But here's what Daniel didn't know yet. Melissa hadn't gone home. She was meeting someone. Not Thomas. Someone else. And that meeting would determine whether this probation period became reconciliation or rupture. Melissa didn't go home after she left the house that morning. Daniel assumed she did. I assumed she needed space. We were both wrong. At 1:43 p.m., Frank stepped into my office. "Hal," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. "Yes." He hesitated. "I don't like interfering in family matters." "Then don't." "It's not family," he replied. "It's optics." "That word again." "Optics." "What did you see?" I asked calmly. "She was at the Riverside Cafe." "And?" "With someone." "Thomas?" "No." "Who?" Frank exhaled slowly. "Vice President of Regional Strategy at Interstate Logistics." The room went still. "You're sure?" I asked. "Yes." "Together?" "Yes." "Talking?" "For nearly an hour." Silence. My first instinct was not anger. It was pattern recognition. Momentum doesn't die easily. "Did Daniel see?" Frank asked. "No." "You going to tell him?" "Yes." Frank nodded once. "Just thought you should know." He left quietly. I sat there for a long moment. Not reacting. Assessing. At 2:18 p.m., Daniel walked back into the office. "I sent the statement," he said. "Good." He sat down across from me. "She hasn't called." "She won't," I replied. He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "She's not at home." His posture shifted. "Where is she?" "Riverside Cafe." "How do you know?" "Frank." Silence. "With who?" he asked quietly. I held his gaze. "Interstate's regional VP." The air changed instantly. He didn't speak for a full 5 seconds. Then. "No." "Yes." "That's not possible." "It is." "She said she didn't want acquisition." "She may not." "Then why meet with them?" "To understand options." He stood up abruptly. "This is ridiculous." "Yes." He grabbed his phone. "I'm calling her." "No." He froze. "Why?" "Because you don't react mid-meeting." "You expect me to wait?" "Yes." "For what?" "For clarity." He stared at me. "This is betrayal." "Maybe," I replied calmly. "Or maybe it's fear." "Fear of what?" "Losing scale." Silence. He paced once across the office. "She knew the panel decision." "Yes." "She knew probation." "Yes." "And she still met with them." "Yes." Silence. Heavy. "You think she's planning something else?" "I think she's assessing her position." He stopped pacing. "You sound calm." "I am." "How?" "Because panic is acceleration." Silence. Daniel leaned against the desk. "What if she wants out?" "That's her choice." "And if she wants to move forward without us?" "She can't touch trust-protected assets." "That's not what I mean." I understood. "Marriage. Alignment. Future." "I don't know," I said honestly. Silence. He sat back down slowly. "She didn't fight the suspension," he said quietly. "No." "She didn't argue after the memo." "No." "She just recalculated." "Yes." Silence. "I married ambition," he said softly. "Yes. But I thought it aligned with mine." "Ambition aligns until priorities diverge." He nodded faintly. "Do you think she ever actually saw this as legacy?" "Yes." And as opportunity." Silence. He stared at the floor. "I told her this morning I'd accept probation." "And?" "She didn't argue." "Interesting." Yes. Because ambition doesn't surrender easily. Unless it has another route. At 3:02 p.m., his phone buzzed. Melissa. He stared at the screen. Then answered. Where are you? He asked evenly. A pause. Out. With who? Another pause. Industry contact. He closed his eyes briefly. Interstate. Silence. Then. Yes. For what? To understand market positioning. You understand what that looks like? Yes. And you still went? Yes. Silence. Why? He asked quietly. Because if probation limits you, we need options. There it was again. Options. Daniel's voice didn't rise. You're planning around me. I'm planning for us. Without me. You're constrained. I'm correcting. You're slowed. I'm anchored. Silence. I won't be small, she said quietly. You're not small, he replied. You don't see it, she said. See what? Where this industry is going. And where is that? Consolidation. At the cost of identity? At the gain of survival. Silence. Survival from what? He asked. Being irrelevant. He looked at me. Then back at the phone. We're not irrelevant. You are if you refuse scale. Silence. Did you discuss acquisition? He asked. No. Did they? They asked. And? I listened. Silence. I won't rush, he said quietly. Then I will evaluate. He inhaled slowly. Evaluate what? My future. The line went quiet. Not disconnected. Just still. Then she ended the call. Daniel lowered the phone slowly. She's not stepping back, he said. No, I replied. She's accelerating. Yes. Silence. He leaned back in the chair. Did you ever doubt Mom? No. Why? Because her ambition was preservation. Silence. And if Melissa's is expansion? Then you decide whether expansion without preservation is worth it. He didn't respond. Because that answer requires solitude. The sun shifted outside the warehouse windows. 3:47 p.m. Probation had been active for less than 7 hours. And already the fault line was widening. Daniel looked at me slowly. What would you do? That's the wrong question. Why? Because this isn't my marriage. Silence. But this is my legacy. Yes. And you're choosing legacy. Yes. He nodded faintly. I need to talk to her tonight. Yes. Alone. Yes. Silence. He stood slowly. I'm not too old to run this family, I said quietly. He almost smiled. No, he replied. You're not. But you're old enough to let me decide my own. Yes. He nodded. Then left the office. I remained seated. Not anxious. Waiting. Because here's something I've learned over decades. When ambition meets boundary, it either recalibrates or departs. And by morning, Daniel would know which one he married. Daniel didn't come home that night. Not to my house. He went to his own. He texted me once at 8:12 p.m. We're talking. That was all. I didn't reply. Some conversations don't need witnesses. At 10:47 p.m., my phone buzzed again. Not a text. A call. I answered immediately. His voice was steady. She wants to sell. Silence. Not shock. Confirmation. She says if we don't move within the next 2 years, Interstate will absorb competitors around us and force our hand anyway. And what do you say? I asked calmly. I said I won't mortgage the land. Silence. And? She said land is sentimental. And what did you say? I said sentiment is history. A long pause. She says I'm choosing you over her. And are you? Another pause. No, he said quietly. I'm choosing what I believe. Silence. She said if I refuse to explore acquisition paths after probation, she'll step away. From the company? I asked. From me. The words landed differently. Not strategic. Personal. I closed my eyes briefly. When did it become conditional? I asked softly. I think it always was, he replied. Silence. She says she can't spend her life protecting something small. And you? I don't see it as small. Silence. You're calm, he said. Yes. How? Because you're not being rushed. Silence. She's staying at her sister's tonight. Good. Good. Yes. Why? Because distance clarifies. Silence. She said you manipulated this. Did I? I asked. No. Silence. She said you set a trap. No. Silence again. She said you wanted this outcome. I took a slow breath. I wanted transparency. Silence. And now, he asked. Now you decide. He exhaled softly. I didn't see how far it had gone. I know. Silence. She said I'm afraid. Are you? Yes. Of what? Regret. Silence. Regret which way? I asked. Regret losing her. And? Regret losing us. Silence. Only one of those survives compromise, I said gently. He didn't answer. Because he knew. At 7:32 a.m. the next morning, Daniel was back at my kitchen table. He hadn't slept. Neither had I. He looked older than he did Sunday. Not physically. Waited. She packed a bag, he said quietly. Silence. For how long? She didn't say. And you? I didn't stop her. Silence. Why? Because she asked me one question. What? If Interstate offered 10 times valuation tomorrow, would you refuse on principle? And what did you say? Yes. Silence. And she said? She said that's why we'll never be significant. The grandfather clock ticked faintly. 8:01 a.m. And what do you think? I asked quietly. He looked at me. I think she measures significance in headlines. And you? I measure it in continuity. Silence. That's not small, I said. I know. He sat back slowly. She wanted commitment to growth beyond probation. And you? I committed to preservation first. Silence. She called it fear. And you? I called it discipline. He almost smiled faintly. Mom would have liked that. Yes. Silence. She asked me if I'd ever choose her over you. And? I told her this isn't about you. What did she say? She said it always was. Silence. She believes you never intended to step back. She's right. He blinked. What? I never intended to disappear. Silence. But I intended to guide. He nodded faintly. She thinks that's control. It's stewardship. Silence. And now, he asked. Now you show consistency. For who? For yourself. Silence. Probation began in practice that morning. Daniel arrived at the warehouse at 6:30 a.m. Earlier than usual. He sat with Frank. He reviewed contracts without expansion clauses. He asked questions about employee families. Not margins. Not acquisition forecasts. Families. Word travels fast in small companies. By noon, everyone knew something had shifted. Not ownership. Tone. Melissa didn't call. Not that day. Not the next. On the third day, she sent one message. We need to decide what kind of life we're building. Daniel stared at it for a long time. Then replied. We already are. She didn't answer. Weeks passed. The panel continued oversight quietly. Thomas submitted his statement. It did not help him. He framed everything as aggressive growth modeling. The panel called it premature positioning. Melissa declined formal participation. That was noted. Probation meetings became routine. Daniel didn't resist them. He attended every one. He presented conservative scaling models. No leveraged land. No workforce reduction projections. Interstate stopped calling. They found easier targets. That's the thing about consolidation. It prefers doors that open. Ours stopped opening. 3 months into probation, Daniel came home one evening and sat at my kitchen table. She filed, he said quietly. For what? I asked. Separation. Silence. Not shock. Completion. She said we're building different futures. And are you? Yes. Silence. Do you regret it? I asked gently. He thought for a long moment. No. Silence. I regret that we didn't see it sooner. Yes. He looked at me. You knew. I suspected. Silence. You never told me. Because you had to see it. He nodded slowly. She called you controlling, he said. I've been called worse. He smiled faintly. She said you never intended to let go. I never intended to let go of legacy. Silence. And me? He asked quietly. You. I said softly. You were never the threat. He swallowed once. I told you you were too old. Yes. I was wrong. No, I replied gently. You were impatient. Silence. I don't want to be small, he said again. You aren't. I don't want to be irrelevant. You won't be. Silence. I don't want to sell. Then don't. The grandfather clock ticked. Steady. 9:17 p.m. 6 months later, the panel lifted probation. Daniel retained full succession authority. Under preservation charter. No leveraged land. No acquisition language. Frank remained trustee. I remained anchor. Daniel stepped into the role not as replacement, but as continuation. He never said the sentence again. About age. About control. About stepping aside. And I never reminded him. Because here's the truth about being told you're too old. It isn't an insult. It's a test. A test of whether you react. Or respond. I made one phone call. Activated structure. Slowed momentum. And watched my son choose stewardship over speed. Legacy isn't loud. It doesn't headline. It persists. Now I want to ask you something. If someone told you that you were too old, too slow, too outdated to lead, would you argue? Or would you anchor? Type 1 if you think Daniel chose correctly. Type 2 if you think growth should always outrun preservation. And tell me where you're watching from. Because somewhere tonight, someone is being told they've expired. And maybe they just need to slow the room down.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments how it made you feel. I'll see you in the next one.